Thank you very much, Norma, and thank you for including me as a moderator in this session. I've understood that all the sessions have been quite interesting, and I'm sure that we can keep up that standard. And Sally, thanks for including me into this process. It's my pleasure to introduce some former colleagues of mine. I retired from the school board about sometime last year. Chris Henson, who is our Chief Financial Officer, has been with the district for 8 years, 9 years? 9 years. I remember him most clearly when he was earning battle pay in 2009 as our interim superintendent. I think it was 2008 maybe. 2008, interim superintendent, a job that I don't think anyone would have voluntarily taken, but he was courageous enough to raise his hand and kept our district together while we were searching for a new superintendent, a search that worked out very nicely. So I will, in a moment, turn it over to Chris, who will discuss all things concerning the budget, and then later to Dr. Julie MacArthur. He will introduce her, but I will say the first time I met Julie, Julie may or may not remember, she probably does, about 3 years ago, some of the members of our school board here were summoned down to the Tennessee Board of Education, Department of Education, and told in not so uncertain terms that if we didn't get our act together, and our business practices especially, that our federal funds were going to completely disappear immediately, and state funding probably right along with it. I'm happy to say we're here under cheerier circumstances today, Julie. So that's how we met, and she's done a tremendous job. I just want to take just a moment to kind of share my thoughts on why it's critical that everyone have at least a good, solid, fundamental understanding of school funding and school finance. All of the issues that are being discussed today, there's a lot going on in the General Assembly and the state, and they all depend on having a good understanding of cost implications, like the voucher conversation. Whether you're pro-voucher or anti-voucher, funding is a critical consideration in that. Just like our charter school program. We have a growing charter school program, and there are some significant financial ramifications of that. Additionally, people talk about student-teacher ratio. The school system has been trying, and this year, or this coming year, will be accomplishing extending the calendar a bit. As you may have heard in other conversations, one of the means of trying to have our system be more successful with at-risk children is just to provide more class time. And so all of these issues are very important. All of them are driven by academic cause, but all of them depend upon the financing. And so that's why I was very pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you briefly about that. It's my view, and I'll hush up here in just a second, is that we do not overfund our public schools here. It depends, and you can look at it however you would like to. I have a lot of friends who are in some very high quality private schools. And when you look at an all-in number, looking at our all-in cost per student, their all-in cost per student, and the fact that we take all comers happily. We have a lot of children with very special needs of language and behavior and physical challenges that are quite expensive for us to meet their needs. That those are services that aren't provided in some of the most of the private schools locally, and we do it for less than half the cost per child that occurs in some of our area high-performing private schools. So I just wanted to kind of share that with you. So I think a few other points, but I think I'm ready to just go ahead and turn it over to Chris for you to begin your presentation. Thanks, Chris.
Well, good morning. I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation. I'll tell you, I'm sure others have also said Sally is very organized, very thorough, and she has told us that we have until 10:45 and to allow 30 minutes for questions. And so you do the quick math and realize that I've got about 20 minutes because I'm sharing this presentation with Dr. MacArthur, And so we're going to zip through some slides that I have. You have, hopefully you picked up a hard copy of the slides that we will be discussing and presenting. And then after we go through the presentation, obviously we'll be open for whatever questions that you may have, and we'll provide ample time for those questions. So I'm just going to go through this presentation, and sometimes the questions that you may have are answered later in the presentation. So depending upon your urges, if you want to ask the question now or if you want to wait until the Q&A time at the end, whatever meets your needs. The first thing that I wanted to point out is some statistical information. This is school district total revenue sources, total revenue. It comes from the 2009-2010 state report card, which is produced by the Tennessee Department of Education. You may ask, why are you using the 2009-2010 data? Because unfortunately, that's the most current data that the State Department has issued. Hopefully this month they will issue the 2010-2011 state report card. But if you look at a statewide average, total revenue sources, the state provides just less than half. And this would be the statewide average for all 136 public school districts across the state of Tennessee. The state provides 47.4% of the revenue. The local sources pick up 39%, which leaves the federal sources at 13.6%. Of course, the old joke is the feds provide 13% of the funding, but all of the rules. And sometimes that is the case. But you can see the breakdown here on a statewide average of the different sources of total revenue. If you look specifically at Davidson County, you'll see a big difference from the statewide average. The state only provides less than 29% of the total revenue for Davidson County Metro Nashville Public Schools. The local portion is 56.7%, and the federal is 14.4%. And so you can see a big difference between the statewide average as far as the revenue sources, total revenue sources, and the Davidson County Metro Nashville Public Schools revenue sources. And I'll talk a little bit more about the reasons for some of those differences throughout my presentation. State funding. Where does it come from? Well, we all know that the vast majority of state funding in this state, in Tennessee, comes from the sales tax. There's a little bit of funding that comes to school districts from the mixed drink tax. Some of you may contribute a little more to that tax than others, but it's nonetheless, it is a revenue source, but a very small amount coming to school districts. And then I want to just put in here the cigarette tax, because back in 2007, Governor Bredesen proposed increasing funding for education through his what was called BEP 2.0 program, funded mainly by an increase in the cigarette tax back in 2007. So state funding, how is it determined? You may or may not have heard of a term called the BEP. The BEP is an acronym for the Basic Education Program, and you can see the definition here. It's a funding formula. It's the state's funding formula for public school districts across the state. A little history about the funding formula that comes from the state. It was adopted back in 1992 as a part of the Education Improvement Act. If you hear another acronym, the EIA, the Education Improvement Act was when the state funding formula changed to the Basic Education Program, but there were also a number of changes that occurred back in 1992 as a part of the Education Improvement Act. One of the big ones was that the state went away from elected superintendents to appointed directors of schools with elected school boards. That all occurred in the Education Improvement Act, and there were many others as well. It was developed in response to a lawsuit. There was a large group of fairly small and rural school districts that sued the state of Tennessee over the state's funding formula for education. And so the BEP, or the Basic Education Program, was a response to that lawsuit. And if you don't remember or know anything else about the state funding formula, if you'll remember, it is a funding formula and not a spending plan, which means the state does not tell school districts how to spend their state money. It is a funding formula, and so if you were to go and look at the calculation for the BEP, you would see all of these different components. There's a total of 45 different components, and this would determine how much revenue is generated for each school district. But it does not say that the school district has to spend that money in that way. It is a funding formula and not a spending plan. Equalization. Equalization was a big part of the response to the lawsuit and a big part of the BEP funding formula, because what equalization does is it takes into consideration a county's ability to fund education from its own local funding sources. You may ask, well, what are the local funding sources? Well, there are two, basically property tax revenue and local option sales tax revenue. So there's a term called fiscal capacity. Fiscal capacity is the equalization factor in the state funding formula, which takes into consideration a county's ability to pay or ability to fund education. Because there are counties across this state that have very low property values, they have very little or very limited retail sales tax base, and so they have very limited ways of raising local dollars for education. Therefore, they're going to get a much higher percentage of state funding than a county such as Davidson that has fairly high property values and really high local option sales tax potential. So fiscal capacity is an equalization factor, what is called an equity adjustment in the formula. We'll switch gears from state funding and go to local funding. As I mentioned, there are basically two types of local funding: property tax and local option sales tax. So property tax is based upon mainly the assessed property values, which come from the assessor of property's office. Whatever tax rate, whatever property tax rate is allocated to the schools by the local funding body, which in our case is the Metro Council, as recommended by the mayor. And then a collection rate has to be applied to that calculation, because not everyone pays their property taxes and not everyone pays their property taxes on time. And so you may need to apply some collection rate, whether it's 95% or 97%, to that calculation. The other source of local funding is that local option sales tax. And in Davidson County, that is 2.25%. There is a cap set at 2.75%, which some counties or municipalities have adopted over time. But in Davidson County, the local option sales tax is that 2.25% that is added on to the 7% state sales tax rate. By law, half of the revenue for local option sales tax must be appropriated to education. Fortunately, in Davidson County, 2/3 of the local option sales tax revenue is appropriated to education. There is another term that I just want you to be familiar with, called maintenance of effort, because it's a very important term for school districts across the state. And basically what maintenance of effort means is that no local funding body can reduce the budgeted amount of local revenue or local funding for schools unless there's a decrease in student enrollment. So basically what that means is school districts across the state know that they're at least going to get budgeted the same amount of local funding or local revenue that they had budgeted in the prior year. The local funding body, whether it be a county commission or a city council, does not have the authority to reduce that budgeted local revenue amount. So maintenance of effort is very important to school districts. It also has some negatives associated with it, because there are those on the funding body that realize that maintenance of effort exists, and so they may be hesitant to increase the amount of budgeted local revenue, because they know if they do, once they do, they can't go back. Once they do, that maintenance of effort would apply, and they can't go back and make reductions in future years. We'll go to the budget process, and I'm just going to go through the process knowing that in the limited time that we have with a budget like Metro Schools budget, I'm not going to be able to get into the details of what's included in that budget, but at least make you familiar with the process that we use. As far as budget planning goes, we always start out with our strategic plan. What are our goals and objectives that we have as a school district regarding increased student achievement? And there is a document that's required to be submitted to the State Department of Education called the TCSPP. I think that's the Tennessee Comprehensive Strategic Planning Process, and if it's not, it's something, at least I tried. But it's, some people, and in fact Julie, or some people may call it, I think they call it the big old plan, because it's about this thick. In it, it describes all of the goals and objectives of the school district, how we're going to meet those goals and objectives, and that's what we start with anything we do, including how we're going to budget and spend our money. Then each individual school has its own school improvement plan, or SIP. Hopefully it meshes with the district's school improvement plan. Then we look at, okay, how much revenue do we estimate that we're going to be able to receive or budget for this coming year, and then we develop an expenditure plan. So we start out with our strategic plan, the district goals and objectives. We look at estimated revenues and then determine how we're going to budget and spend the money. Knowing that school districts from one year to the next typically can't survive based on the same budget from year to year, a lot of people believe that school districts should be able to just keep the same budget, keep a flat budget from year to year, and be able to do the same things that you could do in the prior year. Unfortunately, that's not the case with school districts, and mainly because education is so labor intensive. If you look at most any school district budget, operating budget across the state, it'll average about 85% of the total budget is for people. 85% would be salaries and benefits for positions. The other 15%, if you think about it, it doesn't leave a whole lot for other things such as utilities, fuel, textbooks, materials and supplies, anything else that wouldn't be considered positions. It doesn't leave a lot for those things, and usually those things you don't have a lot of control over. You're going to have to pay the utility bill whether you have the money budgeted or not. And so 85% of the operating budget is made up of people or salaries and benefits. From year to year, you have increases associated with such a labor-intensive organization. Health insurance. We all know that health insurance usually doesn't go down. It usually doesn't stay the same. In fact, it usually increases. So just going from one year to the next, there are increases in health insurance. In Metro Davidson County, the split between employee and employer is 75% of the premium is paid by the employer, 25% of the premium is paid by the employee, which is the same as Metro government. There are school districts across the state where the district picks up the full 100% for single coverage and some amount for the family coverage. Then there are some across the state where the school district picks up a much smaller percentage of the premium. But in Metro Davidson County, it's a 75%, 25% split. Pension costs. Every certificated employee, and when I say certificated, I mean any position that requires a teaching certificate. Every certificated employee is required to be a member of the state retirement plan, which is called the Tennessee Consolidated Retirement System, or TCRS. It is a defined benefit plan. The state tells us as a school district how much we are going to have to pay into the pension plan based upon an employer contribution rate. Again, typically that rate, especially over the last several years, has not gone down. In fact, it has increased, and in fact, a few years ago, there was about a 60% increase in the employer contribution rate that school districts across the state had to pick up. And so there is no flexibility from the local school district perspective regarding how much we're going to pay for pension, because we're told by the state how much that employer contribution rate is going to be, and we don't have any choice in the matter. So typically that's another increase going from year to year. Salary steps. In education, most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, the salary schedule is built upon years of experience and educational attainment. And so as employees achieve another year of experience, they move up on the salary schedule. It's basically a raise to those employees, and so you have to take into consideration a more experienced workforce and the additional cost for those salary steps. And then there might be a required state teacher raise, which there was this year. There was a 1.6% teacher raise this year, and so we have to take that into consideration. as we move forward and make sure that we budget for whatever may come out of the state budget process, which typically doesn't end until the end of May. Well, we're working on our budget in the spring, trying to anticipate what the state may do with the state budget. Other required additional expenditures that you may or may not be familiar with, whenever a school district opens a new school, and I don't mean a replacing of a school, but opening a new school, which we are doing this year, this coming year, we're opening the new Cane Ridge Elementary School. Whenever a school district opens a new school, there are not only the costs of the bricks and mortar, the capital costs to construct the building, but you also have increased operating costs because you have to hire additional staff. You've got to have some site-specific staff that you can't just take from other schools, such as a principal or an assistant principal, a school counselor, or a librarian, or custodians, or a school bookkeeper. You have several positions that are site-specific that you have to add those positions to your operating budget whenever you open a new school, which we will have to do as we are preparing our budget for next year. You also have increased costs in utilities because you're adding square footage when you open a new school, or if you're adding additional classroom space. Additional materials and equipment, startup materials and equipment. Usually the construction costs don't cover everything that we need in a new school, and so you have to make sure that the schools are outfitted properly and have all of the materials and equipment that they need because that school has not existed before. And then just general inflation. We all know that you typically can't buy the same thing this year for the same price as you could buy last year. We also have to deal with the fluctuation in fuel costs. However, we are participating with Metro government in a fuel hedging program. So we do at least know what our fuel costs are going to be for the next couple of years, and we can budget for that. And that has been very helpful as the fuel prices have fluctuated so much over the last several years. As I mentioned, utilities, usually the utility rates don't stay the same, don't decrease, they usually increase, and so we have to be aware of the electrical rate or the rate for natural gas or water and make sure that we budget appropriately. And then as I mentioned, materials and supplies, just general inflation relating to those. And then if there are any multi-year contracts, typically those contracts have automatic cost escalation clauses in them, usually based on the Consumer Price Index or CPI increases, and so you have to take those into consideration as well. Budget calendar, just to give you a general idea of the process that we use when we put together our operating budget. As I mentioned earlier, the first thing that we do is develop and review our goals and objectives relating to our strategic plan, perform a needs assessment to see what we need to do to meet those goals and objectives, and as I mentioned earlier, tie all of those back to increased student achievement. We develop the draft budget and present that budget to the board, usually in the March time frame. So we're working from December to March to put together a draft budget. We always post that draft budget on the school district's website for anyone and everyone to see. The board discusses the budget draft, makes any potential revisions. We hold a public hearing in our school board boardroom for anyone that would like to come and speak about the budget, and that all occurs in the March-April time frame. And then the board approves the budget, and we present the budget to the mayor at a budget hearing that we have with the mayor in the month of April. The Metro Charter requires that the mayor present the entire Metro government budget to the Metro Council by May 1st. So we have that budget hearing with the mayor in April, and then the mayor makes his full recommendation of the entire Metro government, including Metro schools, makes that recommendation to the Metro Council by May 1st. The Metro Council then holds its own set of budget hearings through the months of May and June, and then approves a budget by June the 30th. If the Metro Council does not approve a budget by June the 30th, then the mayor's budget recommendation automatically goes into effect. There has never been an instance where the Metro Council did not approve a budget by June the 30th, but just so you're aware that if they did not, then the mayor's budget recommendation would automatically go into effect on July 1st, which is an advantage to us because you may see or hear of news accounts of school districts across the state with budget battles going on into August and September, even October, which is not good policy. And we will never have that situation here because of the way that the Metro Charter is set up. Funding for Metro schools over time, as far as the operating budget goes, you can see at the top of the slide the average increase from 2006 to 2012 is just over 4% each year. So it's about a 4% increase each year on average from 2006 to 2012. And then you see at the bottom of the slide there that the school district's operating budget represents approximately 41% of the total Metro government budget. I'm just going to briefly touch on capital projects before I turn it over to Dr. MacArthur. I'm talking now about the general purpose operating fund. As I transition to the capital fund, I just want you to know that it exists. Obviously mainly for construction of school buildings, for major capital costs. We do have a plan that is submitted each year to the mayor and to the Metro Council. I know you probably can't see this, but the approved capital projects that were approved for 2010-11, the main ones would be the Cane Ridge Elementary School, and then we had a couple of district-wide projects where we had some money budgeted for replacement of school buses. School buses' life, typically they're required to be replaced after 15 years. And then technology, $5 million was included for technology, even though the request was for $17.5 million for technology. We received $5 million. The rest of these are all related to stimulus funding that the school district received through the federal government, where we have a large number of roofing projects, air conditioning projects. We also have some renovation projects. We are currently renovating 4 schools, Hermitage Elementary, Gateway Elementary, Lytton Middle School, and Chadwell Elementary. And they are all being funded through the stimulus funding that we received back in 2010-11. We have not received any capital funding for 2011-12. And all indications are that we will not. Typically, we receive that capital funding in July or August, which we would have received this prior July or August. Then we thought we were going to receive it maybe a little later in the fall. Now all indications are that we may not receive any until later in the spring. And so we've got a listing of projects that the school board has already approved for this current fiscal year, 2011-12, that we hope to get funded sometime in the near future as recommended by the mayor and ultimately approved by the Metro Council. The last thing that I'll mention is the fact that we do have a 10-year capital master plan, facility master plan, that takes into consideration, and I'll just flip through these, and I know, again, the purpose is not for you to be able to read these, but just for you to understand that we do have a capital master facilities plan. The schools or the facilities that have the lowest condition score, then they're top priority. We have surveyed every single one of our school facilities and determined, based upon a set of over 30 different criteria, what the condition score is for each of those facilities. And the lower the condition score, the higher the priority, which means it gets moved to the front as far as requesting of capital funding. And also, if a school is overutilized, which means it's overcrowded, it has a large number of portables on site, that also moves it to the top as far as priority goes. So it takes into consideration facility condition score and facility utilization to determine the priority level relating to the capital budget itself. So I'll just flip through these. We also have at the end district-wide projects such as technology, school buses, major projects that we also request each year. And Julie, I hope I didn't take more than my 20 minutes, but we're going to transition to Dr. MacArthur. And I'll introduce Dr. Julie MacArthur. Spent a large number of years at the State Department of Education, where she was in charge of all federal funding for the entire state of Tennessee. We're very fortunate to have her as Executive Director of Federal Programs for Metro Nashville Schools.
Good morning, everyone. It's a delight to be here with you, and thank you, Chris. If you remember from Chris's slide, he talked about in Metropolitan Nashville Schools about a little over 14% of the income coming in is federal education dollars. But that 14% drives most of the reforms in the school district and in the state and nationally. When you hear and you open the newspaper and the front page is about teacher evaluations, the new teacher evaluation system, that's the result of the state of Tennessee applying and receiving Race the Top funds. That's a federal education program. So the federal education dollars, as I said, are on top of the general operating budget, but they really do seem to accelerate the reforms within the out. For example, in last school year, 2010 to 2011, there was over $121 million in the school district budget that was a result of federal education dollars. Now, many of those dollars were associated with the stimulus package, ARA, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which came in, provided quite a bit of money, but also, unfortunately, the money then decreased, stopped. So this school year, you can see we have gone from $121 million last year to a little over $93 million this year. You can see this is dramatically, it represents what the funding cliff has been for us. So we are still adjusting to this loss of federal dollars, as is every other state and school district. Now, when we talk about federal education dollars, let me talk about the ones that are the most well-known and that have the most impact on the school district. The one that has the most money that comes in and drives the reforms, I would say, under No Child Left Behind, is a program called Title I. The title here means a section of the law. This program provides this school year about $32 million. Those funds are directed at schools with a high percentage of children from poverty to help close the achievement gap. And those funds are also have a lot of strings attached to them. The whole accountability system that the state uses and every state uses is for how we hold schools and districts accountable for student achievement is attached to Title I. So if, for example, a state or a school district says, we don't want to do that, we don't like that part of No Child Left Behind, what then happens is the state and the federal government hold the money. So the money becomes the stick and the carrot to drive the reforms. In addition to that, for students that have special needs, also known as special education, there's money coming in from the federal government, for example, about $17.5 million to help the school district address the special needs of those children. There are also some other funding sources you may be aware of, special money coming in to help improve the quality of teachers. And under a program called Carl Perkins for career and technical education, we also receive money. Now, those grants that I just talked to you about are formula driven. Certain number of children in a certain category drives the funding into our school district. Now, we need to meet requirements to get the money. It's not automatic. We have to apply for it. But as long as we jump through the hoops, we receive those funds. But in the federal government, there are also discretionary grants, competitive grants, ones that either we as the state of Tennessee or a school district have to apply and compete for. In our district, we have quite a few of those grants. For example, you're all familiar with the Race the Top grant. Tennessee was one of the few states and one of the earliest states to apply for those funds and be awarded those funds. We receive in Metropolitan Nashville a little over $3 million through a formula, and another $8.5 million that we applied for separately from the state, for a total of almost $39 million through 2014 to help us with our reforms. We also have special grant funds that help us with schools that are struggling for academic achievement. And they're identified for the state as, we call them high priority schools that are not meeting the expectations for achievement. We receive about $9 million under that. We also applied for and received a special grant called the Teacher Incentive Fund. Chris mentioned to you, most teachers in most school districts fund and provide salaries to teachers by the number of years they've worked and by their educational level. Now, I think most of you are aware that most of the professions in the country across the world don't compensate people that way. So there are special funds, and here in Nashville, we are stepping forward with 22 of our schools, the highest poverty schools, where we have the most trouble recruiting and retaining our best teachers. And we have a special program where those teachers and the principals in those schools, if they can meet certain benchmarks, improve student achievement, and other benchmarks, and they can receive additional compensation, which you might know as performance pay. In Metropolitan Nashville, this is our first step in the process of looking at refining the way we're compensating our teachers, so their effectiveness becomes an important part of their compensation. There's also a magnet school grant of about $4 million that we have currently in the school district to open new magnet programs, to provide more choice to parents and help also diversify the race and ethnic balance in some of our schools. So when you talk about it, federal funds don't come into the school district or the state just to replace the state and local funds so that our tax burdens are lower. It cannot be done. The federal funds are used primarily to supplement what is a basic education provided by the school district through state and local funds. That's one of the reasons why they are so powerful in helping drive reform across the United States. So let's talk a little bit about these big federal education programs that we receive here in the Metropolitan Nashville. The most famous one is the Title I program. This one started under President Johnson as part of his war on poverty. I don't know if you're aware of it. President Johnson was a teacher before he got into politics in Texas. And he taught a lot of children that were very poor. And he saw the link between the income, the family income of those children and the quality of education they receive. Because of that, he said, what can I do at the national level to begin to close that gap? Understanding that we cannot get rid of poverty without improving education in this country. So this program, Title I, comes out of that program that's over 40 years old now to help provide additional funds to schools that have a high number and percent of children that come from poverty. Now, with our money here in Metropolitan Nashville, we do two things. One thing is we remove some of the money off the top for district-wide initiatives. And the second thing we do is we provide individual school allocations to schools that have a large number of children in poverty. Those school allocations, the schools use based on their own needs. We don't go and tell them, you must do this, you must do this. We approve their plan, but we don't dictate their plan. So let's talk about some of the things you may be aware of in Nashville schools that we're doing and where these initiatives are attached. For example, off of Title I, if you look down here, we have a lot of what are called instructional coaches. Those are very effective, specially trained teachers who work with classroom teachers on a daily basis while they're in the classroom to improve the effectiveness of those teachers. Dr. Register, our director of schools, believes that the best way to improve student achievement is to ensure that every classroom teacher is the most effective they can be. So how do you improve the teacher's ability to deliver instruction? Here in Nashville, one of the ways that we believe, and the research shows helps, is by making sure, besides the principal in the building, we have additional staff who have proven their effectiveness and work with those teachers in the classroom to improve instruction. So we have $8 million devoted just to that initiative. We also have some money devoted to pre-kindergarten classes, reading clinics for students struggling to read, providing transportation for students taking tutoring, and we're also entering a very innovative contract with a British company called Tribal to help turn around our lowest performing schools. This is some of the examples of how federal dollars drive the kind of reform we're talking about in the schools. Now, for each school, we give them a pot of money out of Title I if they're a Title I school. We don't give all the money to all the schools in the district. It's targeted at the schools that need it the most because they have the most children that are on a free and reduced lunch program, meaning they're in poverty. So this year, we have 113 schools served by Title I. They have at least 50% of their students that are in poverty. And it gives you an idea of how much additional funds each of these schools receives to help them meet the needs of the children that struggle in their school because they're disadvantaged by their background. What do? They take their school improvement plan every year that Chris is talking about. They look at these additional funds and they program them in a way that they believe will best help the students in the schools. They hire additional supplemental staff, maybe somebody, a family liaison position that works with the parents, an additional instructional coach, special tutoring, certain kind of technology and programs so these children have extra to help make up that difference. Now, the federal government doesn't just provide the dollars, especially nowadays, and just say, go ahead, spend those dollars. We have to attach evaluations to them and accountability. So, for example, the program I just talked about, the Teacher Incentive Fund in 22 of our schools, that's going to provide extra compensation to educators if they can show they're impacting student achievement. We've got to evaluate that program to see if it works. So in that case, we're partnering here with Vanderbilt to evaluate the effectiveness of providing additional compensation for teachers and principals if they are in these struggling schools and can show they're making a difference. So these are the kind of outcomes that that program is requiring us to look at as we go forward to evaluate it. Most federally funded programs that are competitive are pilots. You're aware that President Obama didn't give Race to the Top to all 50 states. We had to compete, and only a small number of states, about 12, have those funds, those programs. Why? Because we're trying to establish pilots for reform. Here in the state of Tennessee, we've been courageous. We've admitted where the educational system has been, how low it's been across the state for many years, and we have pledged through the former governor and the current governor to turn that around. So we have pledged to do very significant reforms, such as the annual teacher evaluation that you're hearing so much about. So these are really pilot programs. If we can show in Tennessee this is making an impact, then the federal government hopes to be able to seed that kind of approach across the United States. Most federal programs are really targeted at struggling students. It's not your high academic students, it's the students that for some reason need extra funds and we need to take a special approach. Whether they're poor, whether they're in special education, whether they come to school speaking another language besides English. So most of those programs are going to target students that are more of a challenge for the schools to address with these funds. Now you may have heard, President Obama, under No Child Left Behind, has said Congress can't get through changing that law, reauthorizing it, and passing it again. There have been many good things with No Child Left Behind, but there's also been a lot of unintended negative consequences. Unfortunately, our Congress has not been able to come on this and many other areas to an agreement of what to change and when. Because of this, President Obama stepped forward and said, this is broken. Parts of No Child Left Behind are broken. He is saying that we, as a state and other states, can apply for a waiver to propose new systems to help repair that. Today, the state of Tennessee has released a draft application of their waiver to replace No Child Left Behind accountability system with a new system that's in line with First the Top. So today, after I leave here, I'm going to read that draft, listen to a webinar, and hope that Tennessee and expect that we will replace No Child Left Behind with accountability system that will support our efforts for reform. One of the problems that happened with No Child Left Behind, as you're probably all aware, it's very lofty to say that we're going to reach 100% proficiency for all children, and we certainly intend to by 2013, but 2014. But what is happening now is because we're getting closer to that, and the schools across the United States have not been able to meet these increased benchmarks towards 100%. There's no purpose in identifying every school as failing. So the purpose of the waiver and Tennessee's approach will be to really identify those schools that are struggling the most, and for the other schools, encourage them to reach high standards. So that's the end of my presentation on federal education dollars, and we'll have David Fox, our colleague, help facilitate discussions and questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you both, Chris and Julie. Julie made a very good point that the very important reforms that you're hearing so much about are in great part driven by the Federal Programs Department. And so we were fortunate that Dr. Register poached her from the State Department of Education and had her repair our programs that work so well right now. So why don't we begin with some questions? We have maybe 20, 25 minutes or so. Yes, ma'am.
It occurs to me that there's one other source of revenue that we may not obtain. If I'm not mistaken, when you go for your license tax in Davidson County, then not a school fee on that,
Right. The question was tied into your license fee. Are you also paying your driver's license? Are you also paying a school fee that goes to it?
not on the driver's license, on the tags for my car.
On the tags for your car, is there also a portion that goes to schools?
My understanding is that in this county, there is not any revenue coming to the school district from the wheel tax. However, in other counties, there are school districts that the county commission or whatever funding body, they have made available some of the wheel tax revenue to come into the school district. But in Davidson County, we don't receive any wheel tax revenue.
This whole series has really encouraged me, the efforts that are going on to try to improve things. I think today, you hear that Title I has been around for 40 years, targeting the children, and we're still in this kind of shape. Is there any explanation, or have we made any grounds in 40 years that money being dedicated?
So the question is, what has been the effectiveness of the Title I funds over the last 40 years in accomplishing its original purpose?
Well, this is what Congress asked in early 2000 when they looked at the law and reauthorized it in the new version called No Child Left Behind. They wanted to increase the accountability and the effectiveness of those funds. Now, I would say that when President Johnson first passed that law and others, there was a closing of the achievement gap between poor students and wealthier students, and between minority students, particularly African American and white, for many years. But that gap started widening again in the 1990s and 2000s. That's why the federal government is trying to use Title I to drive the reforms. Now, I'm hopeful that without that money, we'd probably be in worse shape than we are now. But that is really the key, the question that we have to ask. How do we not only accelerate reform for all students in all schools, but particularly the students that are most disadvantaged? From my perspective, we're going to have to take continued courageous steps forward. I want to tell you honestly that in schools that are Title I high poverty, they often have the least experienced, least effective teachers. And that's because of various reasons why that happened, but that's where we're going to target a lot of our attention, making sure we're able to recruit the best teachers into those schools. A lot of agreements that were made between school boards, school districts, and teacher unions allowed a lot of teachers to have where they're going to teach. Well, schools, I've taught in these Title I schools, there's significantly more challenges teaching in schools with children who come with less resources, often maybe chaotic family lives than there are in others. So some of the things that we need to do to improve these programs, I believe the state of Tennessee and the federal government now are putting things in place that maybe help these funds be more effective than they have been.
Just to
Chris?
follow up on that then, if you identified that it did help till the early 90s and then it slid again, have you been able to identify what caused that slide again?
This is more than just Title I. I want you to think back, there was a lot of, under President Johnson, right after, affirmative action programs and things. So, we had Head Start, a lot of those. Those programs initially seemed to close the gap, and I don't mean just the achievement gap, I mean the economic gap between families that were more affluent and families that were in poverty. I think we're all aware that right now the gap between the wealthiest Americans and the ones, the others, me included, but particularly the poor, has increased. So this is an issue that's beyond education. Although we are doing our best to have high expectations and to make sure that we have the most effective personnel with the students that need them the most.
Chris, did you want to address the first part of the question?
Yeah, I was just going to touch on a couple of things. Over that time period, and again, this is not in any way to appear as an excuse, but over that time period there have been other laws that have been passed, laws which I think are good laws, but for instance, things such as the compulsory attendance law that requires every student to attend school through a certain age. But one of the keys, one of the big ones that was passed in 1975 was the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was a very important law, which I'm in full agreement with. It was the expressed intent of Congress to fund that particular law at 40% of the costs, which means that the federal government intended to fund 40% of the costs to provide the services to meet the needs of those students that qualify for those services. And a lot of people don't realize that the intent was 40%. They've never reached 20% as far as the federal government funding the services that are provided. but a lot of people don't realize that the public school district is required to provide those services to those students when they turn age 3 until they reach their 22nd birthday. And if they reach their 22nd birthday during the school year, then we're required to continue to provide those services through the end of the year. I'm in full support of that, and it's just an issue that is fairly new in relation to looking at the past 40 years. We've had those kinds of things that have been implemented, including providing educational services to students that do not speak English. We've had a number of those students that come to our school district. We have almost 29% of the total students that don't speak English as their first language in our school district, 29% of the whole state. And so they just bring with them unique and different challenges, and it's difficult to be able to provide the resources that are needed to provide the educational services to all of the students. And so you've had a number of things that have been working at the same time, where it's not just been in a vacuum or been stagnant over the last 40 years when we look at things such as student achievement levels. So I just wanted to point those things out.
Yes, please.
I was a Suzuki mom, and I am wondering, since we're going into the pre-K and with funding and with requirements, if we could not work on, say, our tobacco and our alcohol problems and drug problems at the very earliest ages, because the mom goes in, now this is for Suzuki, goes in, and hears the class, and then teaches the child at home, which have to be, reorganized for the school system. But I think this would be very effective, because the drugs, the health benefits or destruction that is caused by the cigarettes and by the alcohol and so forth and all this type of thing could be, worked on at this very early age, and I think it would have so much more meaning to the students. Now, I saw in one of the poor neighborhoods recently, school students from our public school system here wanting to get on the bus. They had their cigarettes with them. They just come from school. And, this is a big health factor in America today. You ask
Right.
any doctor.
Right. I appreciate your sharing that. And pre-K is definitely coming more in focus in Tennessee at long last. Since it doesn't go immediately into funding, I'll just leave it at that unless you guys wish to weigh in on that. We'll move to the follow-up. Yes, sir.
How do you handle delinquent people that disrupt classes, people subject to the juvenile justice system? They have to be educated too. What do you do with them?
So how do we serve students who have been disruptive? Because it is our obligation to do so. That's Chris would like to kind of over 40,000 put on that.
Yeah, I will. We have schools that are called Alternative Learning Centers, or ALCs. We have 3 of those across the county. One is at the old Jerry Baxter facility. We have one at the Cone facility, and we have one over at the McCann facility over in West Nashville. And it is basically in lieu of out-of-school suspension, so that if a student does something that requires them to be kicked out of the school for whatever reason, then there is that safety net for that student for them to be able to continue their education at one of these alternative learning centers. Of course, if they do something serious enough, then they are out of our hands over to the legal system. And we do partner with the Davidson County Correction organization to provide educational services to those students that may be in what's called lockup. And because those students are going to be coming back to us, and we have a new program that we put into place this past year called the Transitions Program. And this is a program for students that are coming back from incarceration so that they can familiarize themselves and acclimate themselves back into the school setting, so that it's not just one day they're incarcerated and the next day they're back in one of our schools.
Yes, ma'am.
I think the state legislature is going to be raising a couple of bills, one for vouchers and the other for perhaps elected school superintendents. And I'm curious as to what our experts think, if these bills pass, how they might impact funding for public education.
Right. I will let I have strong opinions on, especially the second one. The question was, the General Assembly looks like it will be considering legislation on vouchers and the public election of superintendents. And so the question was, what do you think of those proposals and what are the financial implications of those?
Well, I wish you would ask something controversial. I'll touch first on the elected superintendent. As I mentioned in my presentation, as part of the Education Improvement Act, it transitioned from elected superintendents, where superintendent candidates actually went out and campaigned for the office of superintendent, which basically meant that they had to live within the county, if they were a county school district, for them to be able to campaign for that particular office. The Education Improvement Act changed that because they didn't see that as a good relationship where you have an elected superintendent, but in most cases you also had an elected school board, and so there was really not any line of authority or chain of command as far as governance structure. So that was changed. Now all superintendents are called directors of schools. They're all appointed by the elected school board. The director of schools is the sole employee of the school board, of the Board of Education. And so there are very, very few states now that even have elected superintendents anymore because it's deemed to not be effective. If there were a change, you would have a situation, again, where you would have an elected individual and an elected school board, and if the elected individual, for instance, decides he or she didn't want to do what the elected school board thinks was best to do, he or she could say, well, I'm elected just like you are, and I'm going to do something else. You would have a dysfunctional relationship. Also, when the Education Improvement Act was passed to have appointed directors of schools, it gave the appointed directors of schools lots of authority. Prior to the Education Improvement Act, the school board basically had hiring and firing authority over employees of the school district. Now the director of schools has hiring and firing authority, and the school board has one employee, which is the director of schools, and you have a much, much better governance structure, line of authority, chain of command. So it would create a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of dysfunction if that were allowed. So hopefully that will not occur. It's more of a corporate structure where you have a board of directors that has a CEO. That was the intent of the appointed director of schools. Relating to vouchers, from what I understand, the law that was proposed, the bill that was proposed, would take half of the state and local revenue amount per student and make that available to private schools. And in Davidson County, the total state and local revenue per student amount is about $8,100. And so half of that amount, $4,050, would be made available for students to use as tuition to private schools. And if those students decided to attend private schools, then that $4,050 would be paid to the private schools. The local school district typically would not have any offset or reduction in expenditures, because if you have, unless you have a large number of students that decide to leave one school, you typically, when you have 5, 6, or even 10 students leave a school, you're not able to reduce the number of staffing that you have. You still have to maintain the same number of teachers to meet the required pupil-teacher ratio that's set out in state statute. And so typically the case will be that money will be sent to private schools, but the school district itself typically will not have any offsetting reduction in expenditures. And that's particularly from a financial side. I'm not going to get into the political or philosophical side of it.
Yes, ma'am.
Would students that were already in private school have access to those funds?
I'm not sure, based upon the way that the current bill is written, that they would have access. My understanding is that that is the fear that could occur in the future if something like this were to pass. But there are, I think, varying versions of the bill out there, and so I'm not exactly sure what they all say at this point until they actually get proposed in the legislative session in January. I just don't know.
Yes.
Could you share with us something about the waivers that you're asking for?
I'll repeat the question.
Complex.
Right, can you elaborate further on the waivers that the state of Tennessee is seeking from No Child Left Behind provisions.
Okay. Is this something, okay,
Yes,
you
it is.
can do a little closer. So one thing is to replace the No Child Left Behind accountability system with another accountability system that would still hold schools and districts accountable to increase student achievement and to reduce the gaps between subgroups such as poor students and wealthier students. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is right now, and you may have heard about this, under No Child Left Behind, there's a very controversial provision that requires the school district, when it has schools that are deemed as failing or not performing, we have to set 20% aside, that's over $6 million in Nashville, and that money is to provide tutoring to children that are low income if the parents choose that. It's called supplemental educational services. That's another provision that will be waived. Now, it sounds like it's a good idea, but the way it was put in No Child Left Behind is the state approves these entities for tutoring, and we here in the district, if they're approved at the state level, we have no ability to monitor their effectiveness. So if the parent chooses a provider that, and they do, that because they don't know, you know, that is not effective, then we at the school district level cannot do anything. The state has to. So it has not been, from my perspective and others, the most effective program. So we will hopefully be able to release that $6 million that we currently in Nashville are using for those services and be able to use it in what we think are ways that will better impact student achievement. So that's an example of the kind of waiver the state's asking for.
Yes, ma'am.
There were many title programs in the past. Is Title I the only one that has survived for education?
Right, the question is, there formerly were quite a few different title programs. Is Title I the only one that still survives?
No, No Child Left Behind has 10 different titles to it, meaning section of the law. Title I has the biggest money attached to it and has the most requirements. But for example, there's a Title III we received money for, and that's additional federal money to help children who don't speak English as their first language. So there are other titles, they just are not as large or have as much impact.
Yes, ma'am.
The money that is available for raises in the pilot schools, how much of a raise would it be for some great superior teacher? I mean, how much money are we talking about?
I think.
Did
Yeah,
everyone
yeah.
catch the question? That
Yes.
the question
Okay,
is,
I'm sorry, David.
the question is to have a little bit more information of, well, how large are these raises that are potentially available for high achieving teachers in this pilot program that's going on right now?
Are they for 1 year?
And is it for 1 year, or is it multiple years?
It's multiple years, and every year a teacher or a principal would qualify, and it's a sliding compensation, so it has different components to it. A teacher might be able to make money under one component but not the other component. So it could get up to potentially $10,000 more for a principal or a teacher, and so every year we will also look at that and adjust it to make sure that what we're finding with how it works, we tweak it if the plan needs to be improved.
Yes. Actually, go back here and I'll go back to you. Yes, sir.
I have, biggest achievement problem is math, that's my understanding. And I also understand that the most difficult teachers to hire are good people who are knowledgeable about math. So is there any thought to paying math teachers more than English teachers?
Right, the
Yes,
question is,
sorry, go
right, no,
ahead.
it's a problem. The question is that given the fact that there is a significant achievement gap in math, and that's a challenge for us, and it's difficult to find qualified math instructors, is there consideration given to paying math instructors more than some other areas?
Yes, these are exactly the questions that the educational field they're addressing right now. There's been a long history of, you're a third grade teacher, you've taught 5 years, you have a master's, you get this amount. If you're a high school physics teacher, that we don't have very many of those across the state, doesn't matter. You get the same amount. So what is cracking open, one of the reforms is what you're talking about. Just like other fields, supply and demand, effectiveness of results are beginning to enter the equation of how we're compensating, or we're approaching compensating teachers. We do have some programs, especially in certain schools, that pay, at least initially when the teacher comes there, extra money, like $5,000 to teach in certain subjects in those schools. So we do have some of that with the local and state funds. And this is exactly the area that I think we're looking at that needs to be reformed.
Yes, ma'am. And then,
This information is amazingly complicated, and there's a lot of it. How do you go about educating our state and local legislators on this?
the question is, given the complexity of this type of information, how do you educate the legislators on this topic? Chris?
Not to be flippant, I don't know that that's anything that we typically do. That's usually the State Department of Education, State Board of Education. They have, within their ranks, the legislature has education committees, the Senate Education Committee, the House Education Committee. So hopefully that is being accomplished through, as I said, the State Board of Education and State Department of Education. But we also, over time, we have also had some sessions, some work sessions with our own Davidson County delegation on specific issues to raise their educational level when there are things we feel like they need to be aware of, when there are issues pending in the legislature. So it's an ongoing battle, and some are more open to it than others.
And I would like to add that Chris Henson here is probably the most effective communicator on these issues in the state. He's frequently has a lot of conversation with our Metro Council, but has also been involved on the BEP, the State Funding Formula Commission, and is frequently having conversations with legislators, because you're right, it's extremely important that they understand this very complex topic. And I think Chris does a great job of making it as accessible as it can be. I think there may be time for just one final question.
In terms of funding, would there be advantages for our school board to have the final budget say rather than it going to Metro Council? Or are there advantages to the way it's set up now?
The question is, in Nashville, the school board does not have funding authority, unlike most other areas, most other school systems around the country. Would it be advantageous for the local school board to have funding authority?
Did you ask the question about the vouchers and the elected? And a lot of times that question does go hand in hand with the question about the elected superintendents. As David Fox indicated, across the country, most school districts are considered fiscally independent, which means they can determine what the funding level should be for education through the passage of additional taxes or levies, as they're called, or millages, as they're also called across the country. In this state, most school districts are fiscally dependent. They're dependent upon another funding body, whether it be a county commission or, in our case, the Metro Council. And a lot of people see that as a good working relationship, because you've got one group that's responsible for asking for whatever they feel like they need, and then another group responsible for actually funding it. Personally, well, and I'll also say that we also have a group of school districts in the state that are called special school districts. Special school districts are unique in the fact that they do have some level of fiscal independence, where they can set the funding level for the school district within certain parameters. They are a creation of the state legislature, and they typically have a property tax cap that if they stay within that property tax rate, they can set the funding level for the school district across the state. The closest one here would be the Franklin Special School District, and I spent 5 years in the Franklin Special School District. And so I've seen both sides. I also spent 7 years in Sumner County Schools, and so I've seen a county commission and how that works. They each have advantages and disadvantages. I think there probably are a lot of school board members across the state that would not want that responsibility. I know that the Tennessee School Boards Association, every year for the last several years, has made that one of their goals, is that school districts should have some level of fiscal independence, because the school boards themselves are responsible for attaining the achievement results. And so how can you give them the responsibility of attaining increased student achievement at certain levels, but not give them the authority to determine what the appropriate funding level should be? And so that, I think that also will be another one of those things that will be included in this next legislative session, as it has been over the last few years. It has worked well in both scenarios. It has worked well when the school district is fiscally dependent. It has also worked well when the school district is fiscally independent. It has also not worked well when the school district is fiscally dependent. And there are also instances where it's not worked well when school districts are fiscally independent. And so you have both sides of the argument, but I think if you were to sit down and start from scratch and say, okay, we're going to organize a school district and a school board, you probably, with the benchmarks and the high stakes testing that we currently have in this country, you probably would say school boards should be able to determine the funding level that they need to achieve the results they're required to attain.
Where does
Cr-
Nashville
cr-
rank nationally in terms of how much money we put into schools?
Do you want to repeat the question?
I think we may be, I think, okay, then this will be the final question then. The question was, how does Nashville or Tennessee rank compared to other states, and how much we put into education funding?
I don't know the exact number because it changes, and it also depends upon which data you look at. It's always around 45 out of the 50 states. So it's always very low as far as the per pupil spending goes in relation to the national average. But there are other studies that take into consideration differences in cost of living, and so the numbers can change when you look at it that way. But typically it's in the lower to mid 40s.
Chris and Julie, thank you very much for very interesting comments.